are continuing on in our series majoring in the minors. So we're just going through some of the minor prophets, see what we can learn from those. And just one of the things, again, we've talked about a little bit in the last couple of weeks, why they're called minor prophets, not because they're less important, it's just because they're shorter. Isaiah, I believe, is the longest of the major prophets at 66. Obadiah, he has 1. The longest, I believe, is Hosea of the minor prophets, so Hosea and Zechariah, I believe, at like 14 chapters. So that's length. So it really is just that. So they're saying lots of important things that are really helpful for us. And I do want to remind us of the quote that I find really helpful when it comes to the Bible, but definitely when it comes to here, it's by Old Testament scholar John Walton, and basically he says that the Bible was not written to us, but it was written for us. So very specifically, when we're dealing with what's going on in the minor prophets, they are speaking to a very specific issue going on in that time that we're not just supposed to it's for our time exactly. No, that's exactly for that time, but there's things we can glean from what they're talking about, and that's what we want to do. So we are talking about the book of Amos. So, who is he directly talking to? Well, he's talking to the kingdom of Israel, which consists of 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. They splintered off. Maybe a couple hundred years before this, Amos starts talking to them because of the treatment by Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon. He treated them pretty harshly. They said, "Hey, we're out of here." And they started their own little kingdom. So here's the thing. We talked about last week, talked about Hosea. He was also talking to the northern kingdom. Hosea, though, was from there. Amos is from the southern kingdom. So he traveled to sit there. He's had enough. God gave him something to say. He goes up there. Whereas Hosea had a little bit more focus on religious leaders at that time, even though not exclusively. Amos is talking to the political leaders, though not exclusively. That's really important. I know in today we talk a lot about separation of church and state, and then the argument is exactly what that means. At that time, in those nations, they would have said, what is that at all? Because they were very intertwined. So, as much as he is talking to the king and the political leaders and the wealthy, he's still talking to the religious leaders. They're all interconnected in that. So, he's talking to, again, political leaders. He's talking to the affluent. And he's really talking about this is that he's getting in there really big on the fact that they're neglecting the things that are happening to the poor. In the words of Tim Mackey from the Bible Project, he says, Amos just couldn't take it anymore. So, he goes to Bethel, which is a big temple there that was set up in contrast to the temple in Jerusalem. So those in the north did not feel compelled to go down to Jerusalem to do what they wanted to do in religious rituals and all that. They can go to Bethel instead. Now, I really like Amos because I'm going to call him the trash talk prophet, because he definitely trash talks. He calls them cows. You know, he does. He's the cows of Bashan, which is basically a fertile area. He says, you guys are getting plenty enough that you're actually having issue with the poor. You're knocking the poor. You're doing it off the backs of the poor. You're good. You've got more than you need, and you keep taking more, even though you've got more than you need. So Amos wasn't really that popular. Understandable. Most of the prophets weren't. In fact, actually in this, you get sort of a little bit of an exchange he has with the high priest of Bethel, Amaziah. And Amaziah first, he wants to warn the king, Jeroboam at the time, who's considered by a lot of the prophets one of the most evil king. He's also a very popular king. In chapter 7 of verse 10, this is what it says, Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent a message to Jeroboam, king of Israel. Amos is hatching a plot against you right here on your very doorstep. What he's saying is intolerable. He is saying Jeroboam will soon be killed and the people of Israel will be sent away into exile. So he's prophesying what would happen with them being met by the Assyrians. Then essentially right after that, he basically tells Amos to get lost. Go do your prophesying somewhere else. Amos's response was, yeah, this is not a full-time gig, buddy. This is the only message I have. In fact, I'm a shepherd. I care for trees. So nope, I'm here to stay. You know, I'm not like some of those other prophets that just sort of like make a living out of this. Nope, this is me. You're going to have to take it or leave it. They definitely wanted to leave it. So Amos probably would have been considered fairly rejected by a lot of the people in the kingdom of Israel. So, and it's pretty bold. Like I said, I really quite enjoyed Amos. He's bold. Jeroboam is considered an evil king, but a popular one, and even would be considered somewhat successful. He won some freedom for the Israelites that were kind of under the thumb of the Syrian Empire. He expanded their territories, and he generated wealth. Amos, again, being pretty bold, is saying, hey, I have some issues. God has some issues. And he'll even say, God's been trying to get your attention through other prophets, through things like famine and drought. He talks about that in chapter 4, verse 6 and 7. And they're not seeing it. So, they stuck their fingers in their ears, and they're just not even paying attention. Amos starts when he sort of his talks and different sermons, it's different poems, it's visions, and he starts by basically kind of talking about a lot of the issues God is happening in the surrounding countries, and you can kind of see it actually sort of circles in and it ends up aiming for Israel. And though Amos uses a kind of this poetic device. He says, for 3 transgressions of, he'll name whatever nation, and for 4. It's a poetic device of saying, I have one nerve left, and you're sitting on it. Once he gets to Israel, I get the feeling like I've got one nerve left, and you'd be dancing on it. Because he takes more time to break down what's going on in Israel. Now, one of the things we talked about again last week was many of the prophets were what you call covenant-centric. So when he's talking about the other nations, he does talk about Judah, so he does bring in some covenant stuff, but the other nations, he's not bringing up covenant issues because they don't have that agreement with him, but he is bringing up covenant issues, which is the idea is they were, a big thing was that they were just ignoring the poor. And I'm going to borrow from Tim Mackey, the Bible Project, because he summarized it so well. He says, the wealthy, they're ignoring the poor. They're oppressing them, selling them into debt slavery, and denying them legal representation. And like I said, he's a trash-talking prophet. So he says things like, you cows of Bashan, you oppress the poor and you crush the needy. You hate honest judges, how you despise people who tell the truth. He says, you trample the poor, stealing their grains through taxes and unfair rent. You oppress good people by taking bribes and depriving the poor of the justice in the court. He even trashes them by saying, hey, when you do those Sabbath and religious festivals, they're kind of like inconvenient intrusions for you cheating and oppressing the less fortunate. But everyone needs a day off. Chapter 8. Listen to this. You rob the poor and trample on the needy. You can't wait for the Sabbath day to be over and the religious festivals to end so you can get back to cheating the helpless. You measure out grain with dishonest measure and cheat the buyer with dishonest scales. And you mix the grain and you sell the chaff swept from the floor. You enslave poor people for one piece of silver or a pair of sandals. All that to say, Amos isn't happy. God is not happy. In fact, kind of like we see in a lot of the prophets, the people at the time, what they would do is they would keep all of their religious festivals. The ones that would be aimed at God, Yahweh, and then the ones that are the other gods too, which a little bit again more what Hosea talked about. But he's got some pretty strong thoughts. He says this in chapter 5. I hate all your show and pretense, the hypocrisy of your religious festivals and solemn assemblies. I will not accept your burnt offerings and grain offerings. I won't even notice all your choice peace offerings. Away with your noisy hymns of praise. I will not listen to the music of your harps. Instead, I want to see mighty flood of justice, an endless river of righteous living. Now, I want us to focus on this. One, it's not about the rituals. We can look at this and say, like, oh, the ritual was bad. No, it's not about the rituals. In fact, a lot of commentaries said, like, they kept those rituals, and what they would do with the rituals would kind of start some of the issue, because they would actually then celebrate quite extravagantly, little compensation. It was basically of a look how much I love God. No, look how much I love God. Look how much stuff I've got going on here. Look at how much I honor him. And God's sitting there and saying, it's not that. It's who you're missing. It's not about the rituals. It's about how they've disconnected it from the relationships with each other. They disconnected it from justice. They disconnected it from righteous living. I want to break that down. Justice was a lot about righting injustices. They're not doing that. They're actually doing the exact opposite of that. Righteous living is about having right relationship. It's about having mutual flourishing. And somehow they were just compensating from all the stuff they were not doing. In fact, these rituals are about connection with God. And the thing that seemed to be forgotten, remember last week with Hosea, we talked about how they had forgotten God. They were not about the intellectual understanding of God, they were forgotten knowing relationally God. Here is they forgot about people. The point of these rituals, again, they're to connect to God, and as a result, also connect to each other, community, to connect to all of the each others. They weren't doing that. In fact, they were doing the exact opposite of that. They were connecting with their own people. They were keeping it in their circles. They were trying to one-up each other, look how much I can worship God better than you. Financing it off the backs of the people that they just forgot were there. So God is saying to them, I am not honored by your rituals. In fact, I hate them. So what's going on? What can we learn from this? What happens here is you have this nation of people who are connected. And they can prove it through ancestry. They're connecting in their ancestry, and they've forgotten that. So they've actually started to reduce the stories and identities of their own people. They were no longer kin. They were no longer cousin, relatives. They were just poor, exploitable, and reduced. Part of the covenant relationship agreement that they would have with God actually says you're supposed to love their neighbor. That's in Leviticus 19. It's part of the relational agreement. Love your neighbor. Right before that, it actually gives provisions of how to love the poor that are in there. There's provisions. And essentially, if you look at that around Leviticus 19, they were doing the exact opposite of all the provisions that were there. There's a thing in that, they call it, the poor person needed to give something to get a debt, to get some money. By the end of the night, say it was a cloak, they have to give back the cloak. That was a provision in the law. They weren't doing that. Amos says you started using that to make it comfortable so when you kneel and pray. They were just being so dishonest. They were stacking everything against them. These are some of the things, if you read through Leviticus, this section of Leviticus, it says you're not supposed to oppress them. You're not supposed to steal. You're not supposed to deal falsely. You're supposed to do no injustice in courts. And they were doing it all. Then going and having the festival and saying how much we love God. And God saying, yeah, I'm not feeling it. He even makes a shot, like I said, he's a trash talker. He makes a shot basically saying, like, you guys are trying to be as good as David and his playing and worshiping. It's like, nice try. You're not there. Not only were they not loving their neighbors, they weren't even acknowledging that they were neighbors. And so they started to operate in reduced stories and identities. And that's like a big deal. One of the things really bad that we can do is start to reduce people's stories and identities. If we look at the life of Jesus, we see someone who very much does the opposite. He went through a lot of his ministry life that we read about expanding stories. He demonstrated that people had bigger stories and bigger identities. One of my favorites is in Luke 10. It's a parable that we call the Good Samaritan. And it's literally Jesus telling a story in response to the idea of loving your neighbor. They're talking about that. Someone asks, then who is my neighbor? Which is just a way of saying, who don't I have to love? Jesus would tell a story of a person who was beat up and left for dead, robbed. And two people he would start with first, pass them by. One, a Levite. Is that me? Okay. One, a Levite, and one, a priest. And both passed them by. But first we might think, is there a reduced story going on right there? And maybe there is, but that's not the reduced story that Jesus is gonna hit them with. They pass them by, and on the whole idea of like rituals, is probably a good chance they pass them by for ritualistic things. So that means they made the ritual way more important than this person who was in grave need. Then Jesus said there was a Samaritan. Now, probably many of us have heard this story before, but right there, all of those listeners are going to instantly go into reduced story and identity when it comes to the Samaritan. Because they don't like Samaritans. Anyone ever watched Corner Gas? Right? And they're in Dog River. And someone brings up Woolerton. Yep. That's essentially how they would have seen the Samaritan. It'll in the Woolerton to their Dog River. So they instantly look at that Samaritan with reduced identity and reduced story. And Jesus turns the tables, and it's the Samaritan that sees the man. It's the Samaritan that cares for the man. It's the Samaritan that sets up a place for the man to recover and heal. And all of a sudden, all of those listeners, those who asked the question, who is my neighbor, got forced into the idea of an expanded story for someone they completely would have reduced. He expands it. Jesus would do this so often. You think of the woman who broke the alabaster jar over his feet. She was seen as wasteful. Reduced story. Jesus expanded it. Matthew, who would be a follower of Jesus, tax collector, written off, reduced story. Jesus said, "Follow me," and went on to his house. With other tax collectors, reduced stories, who would follow him as well. Peter, fisherman, just a fisherman, reduced story. I gotta stop moving. Okay. This is gonna be hard. It's my nervous twitch. Okay. Nicodemus, Pharisee. Oh, we reduce his story too. We look at Pharisees and just say, bad guys. You can go on and on. The woman at the well, woman caught in adultery. There's a reduced story. Where's the other person? Understand that one of the biggest things why I think the idea that is so way we don't want to reduce, I'm not even moving that much. Not even, I lost my train of thought. Amos, right? Is it my beard? Oh, okay. What were we talking about again? Isaiah? Oh yeah, reduce stories. Anyway, here's the thing. When we reduce stories, reducing stories in such a way that we can move into marginalizing and oppressing people. If we look through history where we see people marginalized and oppressed, it's because we've reduced their stories. We reduced them to not even human. And we could do it so often, especially this is a good message for us in a greatly polarized world. We can reduce stories. And we tend to do that. One of the best ways I think we can love our neighbors, and I always find this hard because obviously that's not any, like we can say that such like a blanket statement, love your neighbors. And so obviously like there's such a case by case way of how we might want to do that. I think one of the ways that we can blanket is we can make sure we're not reducing people's stories. We're reducing their identities. There's such many ways we can do that. This happened this week. Joseph, at Joseph's house, are you coming up for this? You just like, you can stay there. Okay, you can stay there. You're the one who said, I'll come up. Joseph at his school, and he got this from a teacher. It was really cool. They do a thing. They do it twice a year. And what a teacher does is nominate a kid for this award. And Joseph got this from one of his teachers. And this is not based on an award of anything academic, anything like that. Basically, is a teacher saying, I see you. And when we were at the presentation, you can hold that, that's yours, man. When we were at the presentation, this wonderful teacher just started to just talk about these things she's seen of Joseph. She talked about how he was really, really quiet and he's found his voice. And in class, he's keeping them on target. He started talking. He started answering the questions. And one of the things Joseph has is a stutter. And he started just pushing through that stutter to make sure that he's talking. And she says, I see you. And she started saying, I think you should get into leadership because you're such a leader. You're setting a tone in the class. And there was probably about 20, I want to say, kids. That was Thursday morning. And it was these teachers doing this whole thing about seeing them. And a lot of those kids in there, my guess is you walk by, you wouldn't notice. You're just another kid. You're just a grade 9. You're just a grade 10. You're just whatever that is. And it's these teachers that started expanding their stories and their identities. And there was worth being in there. And Joseph all of a sudden was considering maybe I want to be in the leadership track. Maybe there's something that I didn't see. You can go sit down.
Okay, fine.
And I can think even in the area of other than I'm about to reduce the story of this microphone. There I know. Other than allowing just these reduced stories be the thing that we see in ourselves, we can help each other expand our stories. I know for me, is it still doing it? I think I moved it. Okay. I know for me, people saw something I didn't see in myself 25 years ago. And they even expanded my own story because I was reducing myself. We can do that for ourselves. I saw another great story of talking about how to expand people's stories. So this is Esau McClellan, who's I recommend this, reading what this man writes. He's just such an intelligent, insightful person. But he was talking about getting in fights on social media. He was talking about somebody who was saying something about him, and it was wrong, and he went to go to defend himself. This is in the midst of the pandemic. And of course, he was angry. But he came to realize, as this back and forth with this individual online, that what he was really angry was what his wife does had her away in the midst of the pandemic quite often. And he was alone with the kids, and he was getting angry at the situation. And he realized, oh, that's the anger that I keep responding with to this guy. And then he basically said, all of a sudden he realized, well, what anger or trauma is this guy responding to me with? I don't want to engage with that. I want to engage with the actual person. And so that's how he actually stopped the idea that he wasn't going to engage online, because he didn't know what he was engaging with. Was he engaging with people's anger and trauma and fear and all that sort of stuff? And in that moment, he started to expand their stories, even though he didn't really know who they were. There's more going on there. We can do that. The other thing, and this is, for me, I have a neighbor. I want to tell you right now, we definitely diverge on foundational beliefs. But as we've gotten to know each other, we've come to realize, and expanding each other's stories, how many areas we actually converge in. And strangely enough, and this might sound weird, where we actually find some convergence even in our divergence. And by doing that, we stopped limiting each other's stories and limiting our identities. So we need to move past bad, poor, wrong, stupid, dumb, liberal, conservative, left, right. You can fill in the blanks there. And we start to see husband, wife, father, friend, brother, son, daughter, hurting, struggling, anxious, depressed, loving, caring. We start to expand the stories. And we start to see people bigger. Because here's the thing. How we love people is honoring to God. And I think, when I say simple, I'm not saying it's always going to be easy, because some people want to make it hard. It's to not reduce people's stories. When we reduce people's stories, we focus on where we diverge. When we expand people's stories, we might be surprised on where everything we converge. The people in the kingdom of Israel only saw them as poor. And some of them literally could trace their lineage to that person. We need to expand the stories of people. We don't want to reduce stories. As followers of Jesus, we want to start with Jesus and say, show me how you have not reduced people's stories and expanded them. And I'm sure maybe it's something I mentioned. Maybe it's something you've read as you've read through the Gospels where Jesus has done that. I'd like us to pray together. If there's a story about Jesus that comes to your mind as you say that, maybe it's a story that you so value and you just sort of see, oh, Jesus was expanding that person's story. I pray that you keep that on your mind to allow that to be how Jesus will guide us and how we can love those around us. How we fight against the reduction of stories and we can love each other. Because that is such a way in which we honor God. And then whatever rituals, whether it's communion we do right away, whether we sing, when we read our Bibles, devotions, you fill in whatever that is. It can honor God because it's not disconnected in our love for each other's and all the each others. So let's pray. Lord, we thank you for your example. Show us where maybe we've reduced stories, even where we might have reduced our own story. Show us how to see the mighty flood of justice and endless rivers of righteous living. Show us how to, one, have a right relationship with you and also have a right relationship with those here and those who surround us. Lord, remind us of the stories that are shared about you, of how you expand stories. Lord, give us grace as we learn to do this. And Lord, thank you for expanding our stories. Please continue to do so. Help us see ourselves as you see us. Amen.